Hi, everybody. So, thank you for the nice introduction. I think I should retire after this. My name is Yifat. I'm running Leumitech. Leumitech is Bank Leumi, one of Israel's two largest banks, technology operation. We're working out of Israel in 12 different locations. We have a very big operation in Palo Alto. We have an office in New York, and we recently opened an office in London. I'm very happy to say that we believe that we cover and we work with more than 60% of the Israeli companies and many of the funds. I'm very honored to be hosting a person who represents a name which for Israel is a household name. Yaniv was telling us about the ecosystem in Israel, and I think one of the things that we have to be very aware of is the fact that the multinationals in Israel, and by the way, we have more than 300 active in Israel, have been establishing a very strong or famous name for the Israeli tech. I think that Microsoft was one of the first to land in Israel in the development world and have been doing a lot of business, a lot of development. I think Microsoft acquired more than 10 companies in Israel. By the way, which means probably that the acquisitions were very successful. Otherwise, you stop after one. So it was a good experience. So I'm happy to host Nagraj, who is welcome to Microsoft. I think you just joined 2 months ago, right? So
that's correct.
Right. So I'll ask you, Nagraj, to maybe a few words about yourself. Your background. Nagraj joined Microsoft head of ventures after doing this similar role at Qualcomm. So maybe if you can tell us a little bit about your strategy at Microsoft, a little bit of if it's similar or not necessarily so with Qualcomm, a little bit of your strategy, focus, and investment stages.
Thank you. I'll do that, Yifat. First of all, it's just like really quiet crowd here. I'm used to a lot more active crowd when I'm in Israel. So I stopped flying El Al because I couldn't sleep during the flight. So I'm hoping that some of you guys will wake up and participate. Hopefully we'll have a few questions, time for questions. The other thing, Ziv used to do, I've been fairly regular. I think I'm like a returning speaker here. As he used to always ask, I think, that how many of you today made at least one new contact? I mean, this is an event that he uses to connect people. It's a great event. I've really enjoyed all the time I've come to speak here. So how many folks have at least made one contact, new contact? Well, it's almost all the room. For folks who haven't done so, please do so right after my panel, not right now. So just do that after that. So he asked about what I did earlier. For the last 12 years prior to January, I ran the Qualcomm's venture group. I was an active participant in the Israeli ecosystem. We'll talk a little bit more about that. I transitioned to now starting up Microsoft's venture group starting January. Now, just for historical context, Microsoft has had a very strong relationship with startups for a very long time. So this is not, I would say, a brand new activity for the company. What we've had in the past is we've had a series of accelerators, one in Israel that's very successful. And then we always have done what we call late-stage strategic investments that are coupled with business deals. And we're also active in M&A, obviously. What I'm doing is actually plugging that gap in terms of early-stage equity investment, Series A to sort of CD, where the company is growing up, doesn't actually have the time or the money to sort of have a real business deal with Microsoft, but is in sort of operating in the general areas of interest, which for Microsoft is very broad. So I think that's what the strategy is: early stage investments, equity investments, Series A to Series C, D. I think sizes around 2 to 10 million, generally fairly fast, working with VCs, syndicating for the most part. And so that's sort of the strategy. It's very similar to what I did at Qualcomm. I think it was very successful there. The idea is to be a sensor for the company and then invest in companies that can be future partners for the motherships. I think that's sort of the strategy. I think we hope to continue doing that in the same way here as I'm starting out.
Thank you. Can you elaborate a little about your strategy specifically in Israel, what you're looking for, what people in the crowd should know about what you're interested in Israel?
Sure, I'll talk a little bit about Israel. As I mentioned, I think I evaluated my first company in Israel in 2003. So just by that measure, I should be an honorary Israeli. I also, I now have a fast pass. I mentioned this at dinner at some point, fast pass at Israeli security, because I just mentioned that I invested in Waze and they waved me through, typically. So it's always a pleasure. So I visited Israel, I think, over 10 times now, over the last 13 or 14 years that I've been in this business. Thank you for many of the entrepreneurs in the room for keeping me in business. I mean, because of folks like you, I get to do my job. So it's always a pleasure. I've always been amazed. I think I was in Israel in February. My shortest visit ever. It's only 8 hours. Literally, it was my fly out with my CEO. We were there for an event that Microsoft Ventures does annually called Think Nest. And even though I was only there for 8 hours, I'm always amazed by the amount of innovation that's packed into one day that I saw. I mean, I think we were focusing a little bit on security. That's a big focus for Microsoft. So we saw a number of security companies. I think I might have seen the highest concentration of Team 82-based spin-offs from IDF in that one day. But I think it shows that there's so much innovation, and even in one area, there's so much activity going on. That from a Microsoft perspective, I think we have a wide open field, whether it's enterprise SaaS, whether it's cloud infrastructure management, whether it's security, mobile productivity, communication. All those are actually areas that I find that I'm sure I can find good companies in Israel as I start operating there. The one other thing with Israel that I've always been very amazed about is, we talk about companies pivoting. And when I was at Qualcomm, I used to do a lot of silicon investment, and Israel, for the longest time, had very good both silicon investors, but also companies, entrepreneurs that had expertise in silicon. And sort of as that sector has gone out of favor, I feel that like the whole country has pivoted to new areas very fast. So regardless of the trends of what's in or out, I sort of think that that's one of the strengths of the Israeli ecosystem, both from the VC perspective and the entrepreneurs. You'll be able to have some core fundamental strengths that you're able to essentially go where the next innovation is, and I think ride that next wave. And I think now it's so much more than silicon, which was sort of 5-7 years back. That was one of the mainstays of the ecosystem.
Thank you. One of the things that was already discussed on the stage before us, which everybody's asking themselves, and what is 2016 is going to look like, and Yaniv said something about a bump in the wing. I want to touch upon a subset of this thing that we're seeing. So just as a matter of perspective, in Israel we had a Q4 of 2015, which was, I think, the best ever. So we're still in the growing hockey stick in terms of investments. Obviously, we all know that in the U.S. it was a little bit different. We saw a 30% decline in Q4 15. But one of the things I read about is a decline that was actually seen in the corporate investment. So if you look at the corporate VCs as well as the direct corporate investments in the world, it was actually down 50%. It went down from about $20 billion a year to 10. My question is, and I look at the crowd, and I think many of us were here in all cycles, and we usually see corporates who sometimes come in a little bit late into the party. Sometimes they're late leaving, and it's sort of a cyclical manner of investments by the corporates. My question to you, and obviously with the story of Intel potentially divesting their VC, what is your take on venture investments by corporates? Is Microsoft different than others? And in general, your views are?
Yeah, I think it's a great point you mentioned. Many of us have been through many cycles. I've been through 3 or 4 myself. I think the first investment cycle, we were just coming off the first internet bubble, and then we had 2008, and sort of you can argue there is a little bit of correction going on now. If you think about how corporates invest, a vast majority of corporates will invest alongside VCs. So the previous data also showed the VC investment going down. So much of the decline in the corporate investment, anecdotally, is actually traced back to the fact that since corporates, for the most part, co-invest with VCs, as the VC investment goes down, there will be a corresponding drop on the corporate side. I personally am not that bearish in general, because unlike the past few cycles where you're right, and corporates will come in and out, generally corporate VC groups are much more mature at this cycle. There is no shortage of cash that corporates have. So combination of the fact that there's more maturity in the corporate groups, the fact that there is always corporates are still looking for much more innovation, there is cash on the balance sheet, means that yes, I mean, I think they'll go through ups and downs, especially as the VCs correct and deploy less capital than they've been deploying over the last few years. You might see the corporates sort of also correspondingly stepping back. I don't see specifically, at least anecdotally, that there is a mass pullout from the sector. Almost every year we see new corporates joining this. I think somebody in the previous panel mentioned that it's sort of imperative to be part of the VC ecosystem, the startup ecosystem. So I don't think structurally, at least it doesn't feel like that to me, that people are retrenching. I think you'll go through ebbs and flows, but I don't fundamentally think so. From a Microsoft perspective, again, what we did at Qualcomm was a sort of a long-term orientation. Similarly, we're aiming to do early-stage investments with a long-term orientation. That means we really don't sort of see this as, oh, this is the market is down, market is up. As long as you make the right financial investments and you sort of have a good fit with the corporate, over the long run, you'll be fine. So I think that's the philosophy I bring from my previous stint. So I expect to see really no change because of the fact that there's something going on the macro side.
Thank you. Before we go into questions, into audience questions, I want to ask you about your activity with the accelerators in Israel, which for all those Israelis have become also a household name. Microsoft Accelerator has won #1 for a while now. And my question to you is, what is the role of the accelerators within Microsoft in general? Is this a pipeline generator for your venture activity? Does it have other purposes? And just in general, what is your take?
Yeah, thanks. First of all, let me make it clear. I take no credit for the Microsoft accelerators. They have done a great job, and this was done before my time. But I think it has been built up across the globe as a very, very good model for how to support very early stage startups that are not ready for your first equity investment, really. And I think the model has been to take no equity and actually provide tools and sort of support and sort of a very good environment for very early companies to flourish. So I think Israel is actually a model for one of the accelerators that Yifat mentioned, and it's done really well. I think going forward, my role will be to work with the accelerators. Having said that, I think if you think about it, previously, the companies coming out of the accelerator did not have sort of an option of getting Microsoft as an equity investor. The option exists now. That doesn't mean that every company coming out of there will get an equity investment. We will evaluate companies just like we evaluate any other Series A company, assuming they're in for a Series A round. We still have to go through a similar kind of vetting process. We want to syndicate with VCs. We're not going to be leading rounds at Series A so early on. So I think it is sort of, I would say, another source of deal flow, but and I think we'll continue the program. It's very successful, and it has its own place in making sure that startups early on get exposed to all the breadth of tools and services that Microsoft has.
Great. So before the questions from the audience, maybe give one or two specific areas of investment which you prefer to make or looking for.
Yeah, I think when I came from Qualcomm, which was more of a hardware company, to Microsoft, which is sort of the world's biggest software company, it's such a broad platform that it is incredibly hard to say where to focus. We have the existing businesses are very broad, and our interest areas are very broad. A few areas that excite me overall is clearly the movement to the cloud, whether it's cloud infrastructure management or just enterprises moving to the cloud. It's just a very exciting area overall for the company, but also for the industry. It's sort of, I think it's been talked about as a one-time generational shift. And clearly there's going to be very large companies that are formed as a result of that. I think that's clearly one area that I'm excited about. Somebody in the previous panel mentioned deep learning. It's absolutely the time that AI and machine learning will be first and foremost in how many new things are done, whether it's data is analyzed or whether how we communicate with other humans or bots. So I think another area that I think is very, very front and center, both for Microsoft and I think for the venture community, many, many new companies will be formed out of there. So I think even if you just take just two examples like that, That's actually fairly big. If you specifically, I think we mentioned Israel and security. I think that's, as we do all of this, security becomes even more important. There's just massive amounts of innovation, but just these three can keep me personally busy for a very long period of time. I hope to actually expand my team at certain times, so I can do more than just these three. But I think these three are fundamentally very, very interesting and important areas that I think don't come along very often in sort of a venture life cycle.
Wonderful, thank you. We have 2 minutes for questions from the audience. Entrepreneurs. Anybody?
Oh, there you go.
Here we have Ziv.
So I think my favorite thing about IoT is I don't know how to define it, or I think nobody knows how to define it. Having said that, it is clear that everybody will be talking to everybody, whether it's machines or people, and data will be exchanged. The way, at least right now, I'm thinking about IoT is the data and the software and the analytics have a lot of the value. A lot of it will be hosted in the cloud. And so from a pure Microsoft perspective, I think clearly we want to be the place where all the data from all the machines and people talking sort of get hosted, and then we can do analytics and machine learning comes into play there also. So I think overall, the way I look at it is from a value perspective, it's in software, it's in analytics, and it's going to happen. What IoT really means is sort of, if you ask 5 people in this room, I'm sure we get 10 answers. So I think given that it's clearly an area that encompasses very, very broad, and I think it's also how we view it at Microsoft. It's sort of a cross-company thing. There isn't like a business unit doing IoT. It cuts across almost everything we do. So that's why I think IoT is going to happen. It's fairly obvious. In terms of where specifically I see opportunity, I don't think I'm in a position right now to say.
Any other question? I'll ask you one last question.
Okay.
If there are any young entrepreneurs in the room who are thinking of their new venture, which space would you tell them to shy away from because it's already too late for them?
I think it's actually the reverse. Really, I've never, people many times ask me, what's your thesis? And I said, look, entrepreneurs do not look at VC thesis and start companies. Actually, that's the wrong way to do things. VCs will follow where the opportunity arises, and entrepreneurs basically start companies when they see a problem. And I think it's really the reverse. So I would rather ask the entrepreneurs, where should I be investing, rather than the other way around. I'm very open. I believe that there is so much innovation left to be had that I think we shouldn't constrain ourselves with where the funding is today, because where the funding is today may not be the way the funding is tomorrow. So please don't constrain yourself with VC funding trends. If you have a good company and a good idea, you will get funded. If you're not, then you can look me up on LinkedIn. Easy to look me up, and please contact me.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.